Belated Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Hope that you've had a relaxing day and that you got to spend time with your family and, of course, especially with God. So today we are talking about the sixth parashah, which is entitled Tol'dot, which in Hebrew or in English means history. So last parashah we left off with the story of Yitzhak and Rivka, and now we kind of pick up where that left off, and we're going to talk about the history of Yitzhak and Yaakov and Esav. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we are picking up at chapter 25, starting at verse 19. Again, this is a history of Yitzhak. He was 40, so that whole episode that happened in the previous parashah, that all happened when he was 40 years old. Is when his Abraham's servant went and went to his Abraham's old home in Haran, and went ahead and found his family, and was able to convince Rivka to come back and to become Yitzhak's wife. So it picks up after that where it says that Rivka was barren, which means that she could not have children. Now, this is really interesting. You're going to see a common thread that's weaving in and out of Yitzhak's story that reminds us very much of what happened with Abraham in his lifetime. So we see here that Rivka was barren just like Sarah was barren. And so he prays that God would give them a child. And so God answers that prayer, and Rivka becomes pregnant, and she actually has twins. But these twins aren't behaving like normal infants do in the womb. They're tossing and turning around. They're struggling with each other so much that it alarms Rivka so much to say, well, if it's going to be like this, wondering what in the world's going to happen. She asks, why is this happening to me? And so she prays, and God gives her the answer, saying that there are two nations actually struggling with each other. One older, one will be younger. It prophesies that the stronger one, there will be one that's stronger than the other, but the younger will rule over the older one. And we're going to see that play out in just a little bit here. Again, that whole struggle very much reminds us of two other brothers, Yishmael and Yitzchak himself, where they had a big struggle over the birthright. And now we're going to see a whole scenario play out again here between Yaakov and Esav. So Esav, his name derives from the Hebrew word esah, which means to force something with crushing violence. Okay, so it kind of speaks of what Esav is going to become. Now, let's go back a little bit and kind of remind you that that in the Hebrew mindset, in the Jewish mindset, and even in the Christian mindset, your names are blessings. They have powerful meaning. It's like your parents are speaking over you a blessing. And so a lot of times you'll see where God will increase a blessing by changing a name in the Bible or reverse a curse. Okay. Another example of that is Binyamin, and we'll see that later on in a future parashah. But originally it was son of my sorrow, and Yaakov changes it to son of my right hand. Again, Yaakov was wise enough to realize that his wife, in the midst of her dying, had inadvertently or whatever had cursed this son, and then Yaakov went ahead and reverses that curse and gives him a blessing of a name instead. So names are really important in the Hebrew and Jewish, and again, even the Christian mindset. What you name it's a blessing. It's like you're giving them like the essence of that name. Um, all right, so again, Esav comes from the word esa, which means to force something with crushing violence. Okay. Um, Now, his brother Yaakov, his name comes from the Hebrew word akab, okay, which generally means heal as a noun, but it can also mean defraud, or deceive, or cheat as a verb. Okay, now before I go any further, um, this has been used in a very anti-Semitic way to label all of Jewish people as those who defraud others and cheat others. This is not um, this is not a label across the whole of the Hebrew people. As a matter of fact, later on, God changes Yaakov's name to Israel, which means Prince of God. Okay, so even if this name wasn't the best name that could have been given him, God changes it later anyway, so it doesn't matter. Um, so again, if we want to look at it as a negative way, God changes that into a positive. Um, but at its very base meaning, it comes from the fact that Yaakov grabbed Esav's heel as he was coming out of the womb and um, pulled him basically back in so he could try to come out first. So they were already fighting over who was going to be first. Um, and so it doesn't necessarily mean you look at it as a negative way as he grabbed that heel. Um, but later on, that same name, at least in the eyes of Esav, and I'm not sure exactly how Yaakov saw it. I'm sorry, Yitzchak saw it. Um, but it becomes seen more as a negative term, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. All right, we talked about that names are a blessing and must be carefully given. God can change names. He did so to Yaakov later when he was changed his name to Yisrael. Now, throughout the course of Bereshit, Genesis, and throughout the rest of the Tanakh, and even into the Parashah or the New Testament, um, it mentions Yaakov's name as Yaakov. But it's important to know and keep in mind that God changed his name to Yisrael, which was really what God wanted him to be, not what he was prior to that. Okay. All right. So Yitzchak was 60 when they were born. So I guess so. Rivka and him had been married for 20 years before Yaakov and Esav were born. And that makes sense as why Yitzchak was praying for her, please let her have a child, because they're getting upwards in age. It's already been 20 years they've been married, and I'm sure at that point both were frustrated because no children were born, and so God does go ahead and bless Yitzchak with those two children at that time. All right, so you notice here that Esav and Yaakov led very different lives. It's really interesting, Yitzchak's kind of perspective on this, because you would think that he would prefer the other child over the one he actually does prefer based on lifestyles. So Esav was a man of the land. He hunted, he fished, he was an outdoorsman. He was always on the move. That's kind of how Esav was. Whereas Yaakov was a man of the tent. He actually led a life that was very similar to the way Yitzchak is described in the previous Parashah. And so you would think, again, that Yitzchak would have preferred Yaakov because of the lifestyle he led, but instead he preferred Esav and his lifestyle over that. So it's just a really interesting thing to note. Now, again, Yitzchak preferred Esav, but Rivka preferred Yaakov. Now, when it says they loved them, it does not mean they hate the other one. I can't imagine Rivka hating her own child. Now, what Esav does later kind of really irks her and really strains that relationship. But I can't imagine Rivka hating her own child. So when it says that they loved them, it wasn't all or nothing. It does not mean that they hated the other one. It just means they preferred a certain one over the other. You can look at it however you want. It's not fair. They shouldn't play favorites, whatever happens to be. this is how it was, and it does happen even nowadays where parents have their preferred child. There are all kind of reasons for that. None of them have to be nefarious. None of them have to be negative. None of them have to be hateful. It's somehow how that works out. Anyways, all right. So we move on. We start further into Esav and did I type that out wrong? I sure enough did. So that title was wrong there. Esav and Yaakov's um, uh, relationship together as they grow up and get older. We see that struggle in the womb didn't just stop at the womb. It's now made fully manifest outside. It doesn't speak of their really early childhood, but you can imagine because of how completely different they were, there was probably a rivalry and probably misunderstanding and things of that nature that even started at a young age. And now that they've come to adulthood, you're starting to still see that play out. Um, this whole sibling rivalry thing. So Esav comes in from the after a big hunt. Apparently, it must have been a really exhausting hunt. It was hot outside, so he is absolutely exhausted from all that. And the fact that he actually wants wants something to eat right then and there, doesn't wait to prepare his own food, speaks of that his hunt probably didn't go very well. So he's exhausted. He's probably frustrated because he wasn't able um, to successfully hunt something. And so he comes into the tent and he sees Yaakov with this red lentil stew. It says red stuff. It says stew. It says other things in there, but it is red lentil stew. Um, and so he sees it and he's like, please give me some of that red stuff. Give me some of that red lentil stew. And now, Yaakov seems to do something very underhanded here. He refuses to help Esav unless Esav sells him his birthright. Um, now, it seems kind of odd he would just do this out of the blue. What prompted this? What prompted him to just go, oh, yeah, sure, give me your birthright? Why would he think that? Unless he had already heard about this prophecy from his mother. Now, Rivka undoubtedly probably told Yaakov about this because she probably wanted in his mind that you're going to be the heir. You're going to be the one that gets the blessings, not Esav. So maybe she wanted that already in Yaakov's mind. Well, if it's already in Yaakov's mind, he's already probably in a way planning on how this is going to happen. And so when he sees him come in like this and he sees how desperate he is, he sees an opportunity to go ahead and try to get this birthright in a very underhanded method. Again, you can go ahead and go back to Yaakov's name and draw all that stuff in and everything. And I would again caution you to know the bounds with which you're going to do that, because it does not apply to the Jewish people overall, and to think that is very anti-Semitic. Okay, everybody's given their own name, everybody is given their own blessing or the lack thereof, and it does not pass down to others. At least in the fact, let me roll back a little bit. So, yes, a lot of what's happening with this promise was because of a covenant was made with Abraham. However, just because that covenant with Abraham and he promised his descendants does not mean every descendant will be the one that achieves the blessing. Why? Because they still have the choice of either obeying or not obeying. Yes, the overall covenant promise is for the people as a whole, but it does not mean every single person is going to benefit from it based on their obedience and behavior. All right, so back to this. So we read then next. The Esav really doesn't care about his birthright. He's like, what is that to me? I'm dying here. I'm about to pass away from exhaustion. What does a birthright mean anything to me? And so we see here that Esau's very short-sighted. He only sees a short-term gratification. Okay, now some people might say, well, hey, he may have really thought he was dying. Regardless, you don't sell your birthright to save your life. It's just something you don't do. And so he goes ahead and sells this birthright for a bowl of red lentil stew. Talking about a lopsided transaction. And the funny thing about it is, though, he does this willingly, and then later blames Yaakov. Now Yaakov was not innocent in this. However, Esav tries to act as though he had no part in this, when in fact no one forced him to do anything. He chose and actually belittled his birthright before he even chose to actually have this red lentil stew. And so both are at fault here. And so because of Esav doing that, avoiding that red lentil stew, he's also named Edom, which derives from the Hebrew word Adom, which means red. Okay, so he is, and again, that word red in the Bible, if you look throughout the Bible, it's used with war, it's used with blood, it's used with violence. Okay, and that really does fall in line with the meaning of Esav's name, which means to compel something to crushing violence. So far, everything we've seen about Esav has been negative. There's not been one good thing about Esav so far, and we're going to see later on that this trend continues. Now, Yaakov was not perfect, but we're going to see later throughout this, there are glimmers of light that show that even though Yaakov is predisposed to doing things that maybe aren't so great, he's also obedient and actually obeys when he should. And so there's still a stark contrast between Yaakov and Esav in that manner. Okay, so God goes ahead and confirms the covenant with Yitzchak in a very parallel narrative to how it happened with Abraham. So it's almost actually the same verbatim language used to Yitzchak as he used Abraham when he's reaffirming his covenant. Now again, God does this because of his promise to Abraham, but it does not guarantee that every individual can just ride Abraham's coattail and not have to abide by the terms of the covenant themselves. That's just not what it does here. You cannot earn anything with God based on somebody else's righteousness. Yes, Abraham was promised the covenant. Yes, that covenant was to be passed down to his descendants, but not every descendant would achieve the blessings of that covenant if they did not obey the terms of that covenant. Okay, so again, let's go ahead and move on here. So Yitzchak, just like Abraham, ends up staying with the Philistines. Okay, and just like Abraham did with Sarah, he tells Rivka to lie and not to tell him she's his wife, so that he won't be killed because of her. And this again leads to another very familiar thing of narrative here, where the king of the Philistines is scolding Yitzchak, just like he did Abraham, about them lying about their wives, to where it almost led to judgment upon King Abimelech and all their people because of that. And so King Abimelech actually tells his people, anyone who touches this man or his wife is going to die. Don't touch them. Don't do anything with them. Because, and I wonder if it's not the same king, because Abimelech is a title. If this king was not the exact same king as the one prior, it could have been his son or whatever. Regardless, it was either the same king that knew what had happened with Abraham, or it was the next king, like the king's son, who had heard about what happened with Abraham and sees the same pattern play out with Yitzchak and scolds him and really makes sure his people aren't doing anything with them. So again, it's a really interesting dynamic that it's almost happening verbatim with Yitzchak and Rivka as it did with Abraham and Sarah. Okay, so moving on to chapter 26, verse 12, we see that God blesses Yitzchak 100-fold, to the point where Abimelech asked him to leave. Okay, now if you remember, this happened to Abraham too, where they're told Abraham to leave. Okay, and just like with Abraham, the Philistines quarrel with Yitzchak and his people over water. And again, I know here's a pattern here. I know I feel like I'm kicking a dead horse here, but just like of Abraham, God tells Yitzchak not to be afraid. Okay? And we see where Yitzchak probably watched his father and learned what his father did, and so it's like his father building altars to God, and as places memorials and for worship, just like Abraham did. So you can really see a strong father to son kind of passing on of the torch, passing off knowledge, passing off tradition, passing off so much so to where Yitzchak was very, very much like his father Abraham. Now, um, I don't know, doesn't talk about whether Abraham was really a man of the tent or not. He seemed more balanced in that way, or he kind of did both. But in every other way, it seems that Yitzchak is very much like his father Abraham. Okay, so later, after Abimelech had basically driven Abraham off, he comes back to make a covenant with Yitzchak. Again, just like Abraham, right? Because he came, Abimelech came after he kicked, asked Abraham to leave, and actually went back to make a covenant with Abraham. And now we see him coming out to make a covenant with Yitzchak, kind of the same way. Oh, we kicked you out, but I want to go make a covenant with you. And the whole reason why Abimelech is doing this, just like he did with Abraham, is he's afraid of Yitzchak. He sees how God has blessed him, and he's afraid of him. Okay? And so he wants to make sure, by cutting a covenant, that Yitzchak is not going to come wipe him out. All right? And it's interesting to note that Abimelech arrives at Yitzchak's tent and everything with almost the same entourage he had when he came to see Abraham. It's really, man, it's just so many callbacks to the story of Abraham. It's really kind of crazy how many callbacks there are here. And again, Beersheba is another location of concentration where you're seeing a covenant being struck or cut again with them, just like it was with Abraham. Again, that same callback. Now, outside that, we go back to talking about Esau, and so we see Esau goes ahead and takes Canaanite wives, and you can see that his mind is very inclined toward what the world has to offer, very secular, very the strength of man, and those kind of themes that go along kind of with how you see in Esau's way of thinking. Very similar to Ishmael's, by the way. Very, even though they both had righteous fathers, they chose to go ahead and go more the way of Egypt. More the way of, so with Ishmael, it was more the way of Egypt. With Esau, it was more the way of the Canaanites. Okay? Two nations or conglomerate of nations that were very much diametrically opposed to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham. Okay, so I kind of alluded to it earlier. But we kind of get the sense that behind the scenes there's something going on with Rivka and Yaakov. Again, Rivka was told his prophecy about the older serving the younger, and so she knows that Yaakov is supposed to be the one that actually becomes the heir, is an heir to the covenant, receives the blessings, not Esav. But as it stands right now, Esav is firstborn. He is the one in line to inherit all this. And so in Rivka's mind, kind of like in Sarah's, it's kind of really interesting here because you see that Sarah did kind of the same thing. When things weren't going the way that they're supposed to be going because of the prophecy, God made a prophecy to Sarah, and there's another prophecy made to Rivka, whereas first was Sarah's from a child from her own body being the heir, and now with Rivka, it's Yaakov in the air, and not Esav. They see where things are not going the way they think they should go, and so they feel that they need to step in and do something. And so Rivka does this. She goes ahead and he overhears Yitzchak calling his elder son Esav in, telling him very much like Abraham that he doesn't know when the day of his death is going to be. And so he wants, before he passes away inadvertently, he wants to go ahead and bless Esav before he dies. And so he commands Esav to go ahead and go hunt some game and then make Yitzchak's favorite meal so he can bless Esav. So again, Rivka overhears this, jumps into action, tells Yaakov to beat Esav to the punch. Go bring two of the flock. It's probably goats that she asked him to get, because later on we see that she used the goat skins to cover Yaakov's neck and arms, which are smooth, not like Esav's, to go ahead and deceive Yitzchak. And so she makes the very same meal that Esav was going to make, covers Yaakov in the goat skin. All this, and also puts on Esav's clothes on Yaakov. All this to deceive Yaakov, or deceive Yitzchak into thinking he's blessing Esav. Okay? So now, when Yaakov comes in to present this meal and to ask for the blessing, Yitzchak hears Yaakov's voice, but at the same time, there is evidence conflicting with that, suggesting that in fact he's talking to Esav. Now, remember, at this point in the narrative, it points out that Yitzchak is blind. He cannot see. If he's not totally blind, he can not see very well at all, where he cannot make out who he's talking to. It also talks about that he's been laying down, and they ask him to sit up, almost as if Yitzchak is not very mobile right now. He's really at the end of his life. All right, so conflicting evidence number one. So Yitzchak feels Esav's neck and arms, and so it feels like Esav's, but he still, again, hears Yaakov's voice. Conflicting evidence number two. Yitzchak eats the same meal that Esav would have served him, but again, the voice doesn't match. And the last bit of conflicting evidence, number three, Yitzchak then smells Esav's clothing as Yaakov kisses him on the cheek. But again, the voice doesn't match. However, this time, Yitzchak kind of settles his mind because of the overwhelming evidence of the hairy neck and arms, the same meal, the smell and the touch of his clothing, that it really is Esav he's talking to, and that maybe his ears are playing tricks on him with the way he's hearing Esav's voice. So after this, Yitzchak blesses Esav with every blessing imaginable. It's basically the very same blessing that God promised Abraham, and the very same blessing that Abraham handed down to Yitzchak himself. And so Yitzchak blesses Esav the same way. However, it's Yaakov. So, kind of like ships passing in the middle of the night, Yaakov is just leaving out of the vision of where Esav is coming in to see Yitzchak. If Esav would have saw Yaakov, he would have noticed him wearing his clothes and those goat skins, and probably immediately would knew something was up. So we know that Esav never saw Yaakov leave Yitzchak's presence. He just barely misses him. Okay, so now Esav comes in and asks his father to sit up, and he made his favorite meal for him. And Yaakov was like, "Well, who are you?" He's like, I'm Esav, your firstborn. And at this point, the scripture says that Yitzchak trembled violently. Okay, he trembled a lot. And I'm sure he's thinking at this point, oh boy, I just gave your blessing to your brother. Now, so after explaining this, Esav cries out in despair. I mean, desperately seeking the blessing. Please, is there not just one blessing you can give to me? And his father's like, I have nothing left to give you. It's too late. Um, and so, um, uh, so Esav, using invoking Yaakov's name, um, blames Yaakov for it all, saying he's a deceiver. He's deceived me twice now. He's defrauded me twice now. Even though, again, we read that with the birthright, Esav despised his birthright to begin with. He gave it up for a bowl of red lentil stew. So again, Esav's blaming Yaakov, but not accepting part of the blame for himself, since he's the one that actually agreed to it. So at this point, Yitzchak realizes that Yaakov had took the blessing by deception. But notice he doesn't say anything else about it. There's nothing saying, there's no anger. You can't sense any kind of anger from Yaakov or from Yitzchak. You can't, nothing else. It's just kind of like this resignation that, hey, it happened. And maybe perhaps he considered it God's will. Surely Rivka told Yitzchak, the prophecy told her by God that Yaakov was supposed to be the heir and not Esav. However, back in Bible days and even nowadays, the firstborn is usually the one that gets all of it or at least a double portion. Okay, and so and not only that, but we also know from the scripture that Yitzchak favored Esav over Yaakov. And so anyway, so we know that Yitzchak had to have known about the prophecy given to Rivka. And so when this went down, I'm sure, it's just all conjecture, I'm sure he's thinking in his mind, and it probably brought to remembrance that prophecy given to Rivka, and he really has nothing to say about it at this point. It happened. Now, it didn't happen in a good way at all, and that's going to haunt Yaakov later, but it happened. So, Esav keeps pleading for a blessing. So, instead, Yitzchak prophesies over him about what he's lost and what will happen in the future. And all of it is negative. There's not a positive thing spoken at that point. So, at this point, Esav is completely infuriated. He is enveloped in rage. And at this point, he cannot wait for his father to die so he could kill Yaakov. Probably out of anger at just what Yaakov did, but maybe also thinking that if he kills Yaakov, he can take back what's his. Okay, and that all rolls back again to what was talked about with Esav's name of him being those who force things through crushing violence. Now, Rivka being, I don't know if maybe she's helping with her servants doing the same thing for me. Her servants are passing things back and forth. In this instance, that she hears from her servant that Esav has threatened Yaakov's life, and so she tells Yaakov, "You got to get out of here. You can't stay. You need to go run off to my brother Laban in Haran until Esav cools down." And she says she'll send for him after a few days once his brother's anger cools down. However, as you read later, this never happens. She never sends for him, and it also leads into Yaakov wondering when he's ready to come back to Yitzchak, whether how angry Esav really is, because his mom never sends for him to come back. All right, so Yaakov is sent to Laban. Again, we don't see any kind of mention of the deception that occurred. Okay, nothing said about it at all. There's no inkling that that Yitzchak is mad at him. There's nothing. It's kind of like just an acceptance on the part of Yitzchak. And so he sends Yaakov away, commands him not to take a wife from anybody except from Abraham's family and Haran. He gives him the blessing of Abraham, and again tells him to go to go on. So the Parashah ends by again making a distinction between Yaakov and Esav, in that Yaakov heeded his father's commands, but it talks about Esav disobeying as an act of rebellion and vengeance, and taking wives, not just from the Canaanites before, but now he's taking wives from the Yishmael's descendants. Okay, now Yishmael was Yitzchak's direct rival, and so by doing this, it's almost like a direct offense against his father. A very, very poignant act of rebellion and vengeance towards his father. So at this point, um, we don't know when Esav decides to leave his family and move off to the east. But it seems very, very much here that Esav's relationship with his father and mother were in the toilet. I mean, it was bad, really, really bad. And so Esav, probably not very long after that, took these wives and just moved out east and was kind of separated from his family. All right, so that is the parashah for this Shabbat. Sorry that's kind of late. But nonetheless, I got it done for you guys. I hope it was a blessing to you and that you've learned a lot. And please feel free to read the Parashah portion and to discuss it and to study it yourself. Um, Scripture is not up to private interpretation, but it is for everyone to read and to get something out of it, including you. So please go ahead and do so. Um, if you need prayer, you can go ahead and send any prayer requests to that email address right there. Um, Again, please keep yourself anonymous. First names are fine. I don't need any kind of other identifying information. You can tell me the first name of those you want me to pray for. You can tell me the general things that are going on, but you don't need to get too really specific with that kind of stuff. And I will be very glad to go ahead and pray for you. All right, so brachot, and I hope you have a great week to come. Shalom.